Hello, everybody. I'm Everton de Oliveira, Professor Agua from the Groundwater Project. And it's an honor being here with such an important author. You like the book. We'll bring that to you today. The book is called Cross-Border Impacts Related to Transboundary Aquifers, Characterizing Legal Responsibility and Liability. I had the pleasure to read the book, from cover to cover. It's a great book. You may think that I'm always superlative about the books, but the books are superlative. And this is a special one. You may see the text is very fine. You know that many hydrogeologists are not very, keen on law and, the jargon related to that. But, it's nicely done and well put, so you can read it very easily and you can get the whole idea, which is very, very important. You understand the reasoning behind the law. It's very nice. So I'm very, very glad to bring you here, Dr. Gabriel Eckstein. He is an internationally recognized expert in international and comparative water and environmental law and policy with over 30 years of experience consulting, teaching, and researching in these fields. He works at Texas A&M University. He serves as a professor of law and director of the law school's Energy, Environmental, and Natural Resources Systems Law Program. Very good. Welcome, Gabriel. The other author is Dr. Joran, the late Dr. Joran Eckstein, Gabriel's father. Joran was an internationally recognized expert in hydrogeology, geothermics, and groundwater contamination with over 50 years of consulting, teaching, and researching in these fields. Before his retirement in 2013, he was professor of geology at Kent State University and president and chief scientist of the consulting firm Eckstein and Associates. Thereafter, he served for a year as a Fulbright senior professor of hydrogeology at Tomsk Polytechnic University. Previously, he served as a senior geologist at the Geological Survey of Israel. Eckstein held a PhD from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He passed away in June 2020. We're sad about that. Before we start, we'd like to thank all our collaborators, authors that share their knowledge and experience, just like Gabriel and Joran has done for us today. Translators who dedicate their scientific and cultural skills, volunteers that review and organize the material, and our sponsors who trusted our endeavor from the very beginning, offering their much needed support. And of course, all of you who are using our books, please visit our website, share and like our posts on social media. This is a simple and effective way to help spread the good word about our initiative, because the world needs water, groundwater. Well, welcome, Gabriel. Please tell us about the backstage of the book preparation and the good relationship and influence from your father, Joran, for this book and for your professional career. Please, welcome.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being invited here to speak with you and to tell everybody about the book. This is a project that we've been working on for probably 20 years, on and off in different ways. My father and I have co-authored papers, a number of papers over the years, and we've always, argued between us in terms of how to explain things to hydrogeologists and how to explain things to the lawyers and to policymakers, and just to try to come up with language that they can both understand, or at least in a language that is at least common to both of them. And so this is sort of the background of this book, trying to explain when you have responsibility or liability, right, without getting into the legal jargon, when you can have, you can be accused and you can be held legally responsible for any kind of harm. And that's what this book is trying to help people understand in the context of groundwater, of course.
That's very good. That's very good. So, and what about your relationship? I'm interested in your relationship about your father, because he's not here to tell about you. Father always says good things about son, but let's hear the other way around.
Well, I would hope he would say good things about me. He was a very difficult professor to, I never had him as a as my professor. I have a geology degree, but
Not as a hydrogeology professor, I guess, but life
no,
professor
no,
for sure.
yeah, he was on sabbatical the year that I was supposed to take his class. So I did never took his class, but I was lucky. But he still, I mean, I remember from age 4 or 5 going to the field with him,
Oh,
and going to drilling rigs and well studies and so on. So I was educated throughout my life working with him in groundwater issues, contamination, allocation, groundwater flow, chemistry, and so on for, throughout our time together. And as I said, we co-authored some papers together. We worked on some projects together, and I learned a lot. I learned a lot from him.
that's very good. Well, we can see from the book. It's very good. And from when we see a book from a lawyer, we expect something different. Your book is very good. So in your book, you say that questions related to the legal rights and the regulation of transboundary aquifers. Let's go to the point of your book. Transboundary aquifers remain a secondary or even a tertiary priority on the international agenda until the early 2000s, which I lived to see that. Why it took so long when groundwater is being used for centuries before?
Yeah, yeah. A couple of reasons. First of all, groundwater really wasn't used extensively until after World War II, when we have pumping technology. We have people and communities using groundwater, as you said, for centuries, but it was shallow wells. It was hand dug wells. And if they go 50 or 100 feet, maybe a little bit more. But the quantity of water was not significant, and it was not significant in the context of boundaries. After World War II, when you had the pumping technology really start to invigorate withdrawals, the volume of groundwater really started to expand, and that's when people started to take notice and pay attention to, well, this aquifer is on the border. Are you stealing from my aquifer? They started to ask those kinds of questions, and that's when it really began to become important as a political matter, not just as a livelihood. Yeah.
That's interesting. That's an interesting point of view. So basically, what we're doing then is over a century that we've been withdrawing so much water, as you put, right?
Yeah, yeah. So when you have pumping occurring on the border, if you're pumping a small amount, it's not going to have much of an impact on the aquifer, and maybe not even across the border. But once you start putting large wells, heavy wells, for whether it's for agricultural use or mining use, and it's on the border, the cross-border impact, we talk the hydrogeology terms, the radius of influence, the cone of depression crossing the border, then the other starts to worry and starts to wonder, well, how much water is mine? How much is yours? Are you stealing mine? Are you contaminating mine? And so on. And this was not ever contemplated in treaties. It wasn't even contemplated in domestic law. And I should note, when most of this book is really geared for international boundaries. However, take the word international out, and the book still works. It could be between two, subnational, states with a small s, right? Two provinces, two cantons, two counties, two neighbors. As long as you have as long as you have a border, the book applies. But the idea is that once you have a border, and remember, borders are artificial. We humans created them. Water doesn't care. But you put a border, now you have this political and legal scenario, and that's what the book is trying to help address.
Yeah, yes, that's what I was thinking. Yeah, you are correct. The whole idea holds true for neighbors, for example. We have someone like someone puts for a commercial well that needs a lot of water, and a condominium might have problems because, you know, his well go, you know, its well goes dry.
Right.
That's not uncommon actually, right? And it's hard to decide legally because, you know, the laws are a bit, you know, still non-existent, let's say. Some of the laws are non-existent, and then the experiences might not be so good. So in your book, you present a brief history of groundwater law. And we see that an international law for transboundary waters and groundwater resources remains indefinite and without explicit rules, which is very much true, as we may see. We have the huge aquifer here in Brazil, and we have, you know, the problems in Libya and the region there, right? And many huge aquifers like that. So what are the reasons for this slow move, right? You pointed out that probably because it's young, the lots of use. And the other question is it really possible to write an international rules or only guidelines? That's a point that I'd like to put, please.
So on the first question, when you look at the number of agreements, for example, treaties around the world for surface waters, right, for rivers and lakes, thousands. We actually have thousands of these treaties, and for what we call non-navigational uses, for purposes for irrigation and for drinking and for mining, there's 400 or 500 of these at least over the last 150 years. So hundreds and hundreds of treaties. For groundwater, however, I can count it on 1.5 hands, right? There's about 8 treaties in the whole world for that is specific to transboundary aquifer. Now, why? Well, part of this is that we haven't needed them up until, as I said, up until the 1950s, World War II. We didn't have the technology to really pump heavily. Now that we are, now countries are starting to worry about it, and a few countries have entered into treaties on the Guarani, on the Nubian sandstone, on the DC aquifer, and so on. So there's not a lot of experience, but international law evolves from experience. And when you don't have experience, you really don't have a lot of law. And so right now we're at a very interesting stage where we see a few countries around the world starting to engage and enter into treaties, or maybe even a formal treaty. They may do an informal agreement, or I call arrangement, not official, not enforceable. And just to test to see what kind of relationship they want to have. We're starting to see this, but there's not enough experience here to say, this is the law. This is what the law should be. So your question now, the second question, can we write laws on this? I think it's still too early. I hope eventually we can get to the point where we can write international law, but we don't have experience to really know what should be the law because we haven't tested different laws. Some people suggest, well, let's just use the surface water law, right? The law for rivers. Yeah, we could try it. I'm a little hesitant because groundwater flows very differently from surface water. Surface water, you can see it goes from point A to point B. Groundwater is 3-dimensional, maybe even 4 dimensions, right? Over time. And you have pressure issues, and you have porosity and permeability. I mean, all sorts of issues that you don't have with surface water. So I'm not so sure that the surface water law can apply exactly the same way. Maybe similar, but we have to test it first before we can say, yes, we can have laws. So to the last point, I do think we can have guidelines that we can start with. There is a document called UN Draft Articles on Transboundary Aquifers, which I think states can look at as guidelines, not as law, but just to look at them and see, maybe we should try to use our transboundary aquifer in this way, data sharing, joint management, and so on. Hopefully, at some stage, we will be more comfortable and say, this part should be a law, and this part should be another law, and then we can start to draft something like that.
Yeah, that's true. I like the way you put it, because some hydrogeologists, well, scientists in general are not familiar with how law exist. And you put
Yeah.
a good point. The law comes after, after the experience, right? Because the law has to reflect a common sense to solve problems. And then the solution comes first, and law tries to mimic what's the best common sense is. So guideline first would be a way to go. I understand that very clearly. It's very interesting, and the way you put it. And it's not always clear for hydrogeologists. It wasn't for me, at least, when I started working with lawyers, right? And then you understand. The thing. And the other thing that is important on your saying is that I believe we have lots of laws of surface water, but like 50% of the water that goes on rivers is groundwater, is base flow. So
but you, the hydrogeologists, know that.
Exactly.
The policymakers don't know that, because groundwater, the science of groundwater, we've had it for 150 years, but it hasn't risen to the level of policy understanding. And this is something that will take time to develop. Yes,
I agree. But yes, we need people to this is not widespread knowledge. People don't have conscience about that. So when they think environmentally, even with good intentions, they just don't have the information. That's the thing that we're trying to help with the groundwater project. Okay, so I have lawmakers are not usually scientists, right? And as a result, laws are often a far cry from the established scientific knowledge. We've seen this here and there, and that's scary. How is this book organized to help bridge this gap that so concerns hydrogeologists?
Yeah. So one of the things that we really tried to do with this book is to remove the legal jargon. This book is not, it's accessible to lawyers, but it's the target audience is not the legal community. The target audience is everybody else. And we really tried to make this accessible, not just to the groundwater scientists, but even beyond, even broader than that, because we want to make sure that this is an educational tool. We want to make sure that people can understand, everybody, when I say people, everybody can understand how water can be managed and where responsibility and liability can come up, or at least where you can be concerned and start saying, maybe this is going to be a problem here. So that's the idea, is that this book is written, I hope, in language that is understandable to hydrogeologists, to policymakers, and so on. And so this is where we're trying to bridge that gap in terms of talking about issues of legal liability and connecting them to actual groundwater flow and groundwater contamination and so on.
And I agree. I think I really enjoyed reading the book. I thought it was it's very pleasant to read. It's something that goes easily for a hydrogeologist. Even I have some experience with law, but even like that, some terms, like you said, some jargons, you have to use them every now and then. But then I see that you have brackets, and you tell what the jargon means in a very nicely way, so it's not offensive. It's very well put. Congratulations for this. Because this is when you read a book, it's very common that it's the jargon is so embedded into you, because that's your life, that it goes without thinking, right? You just write it and leave it there. And this book is very careful, and the jargon is always explained. Very good. Very good.
Well, this is based on the arguments I had with my father, because we had to explain this to each other, the science jargon and the legal jargon. So
it worked very well. It worked very well. So you present a few examples where border disputes have been settled, which is very good, because you learn from experience. How these former solutions are being used today for other countries or states, as you put it in the book?
I think that countries around the world are beginning to look at these examples of the agreements where you have cooperation, and they're starting to think, well, how are we using our groundwater on the border, and do we need to engage with our neighbor? Are we taking too much? Are we contaminating? Are they taking too much? Are they contaminating the groundwater? What is the relationship that we're going to have or should have? And then they're looking at this few example. Again, there's only 8 agreements in the whole world, so we don't have a lot to look at. But there's something out there that can be used as examples. I would not say models, but as examples, because we're still learning, how we might want to manage these transboundary aquifers.
Yeah, well, because since groundwater moves slowly, do we have, because we have, the agreements are very young, I would say, right? There's this treatments that they have among states.
Yeah.
Do we have results that we can actually, have some measurements of what's going on if the agreements, because we have to evaluate the agreements so we can improve.
There have been some analyses of the agreements, the Genovese aquifer, the Nubian sandstone. Some of them they've been evaluated, but you also have to think about they have been evaluated in their context. So the Nubian sandstone, the DC aquifer, those are non-recharging aquifers. You really cannot compare it to the Guarani or the Genovese aquifer, right? And they have, so their agreements are very different. Also, the priorities of the countries are completely different. On the Genovese, the priority was artificial recharge and drinking water, whereas in the DC aquifer between Jordan and Saudi Arabia, it was water quality protection and water quantity protection. They actually have a prohibited zone, a zone where they prohibit extraction. Completely different priorities from, so it's hard. You have evaluations of some of these, but you can't compare them. You can learn from them, but it's still, this is going to be a project for us for many years to learn from these different examples before we can say, now we can see, here's the way we should do it, here's the best practices. It's going to be quite a few years before we have best practices.
Oh, yes. Interesting. That's which is good, because it is a hydrogeological way of seeing things, not only law, right? Because if you don't have that background, you may just overrun the whole things and you get something that is not useful at the end, which works against the project, I think, right?
Yeah.
Interesting. Before I go to I have a specific question for you, because when you explain things, you have some very nicely done 3D models there, like three-dimensional figures that show the situation, and then you explain the likely dispute that may arise from the that setting. How did you come up with those? And because they're very nice, and would you think those are comprehensive enough for all situations?
Yeah. So first of all, I will say that the diagrams that are used in the book they originated from 6 diagrams that my father and I developed, and actually my sister drew about 20 years ago. And we've been using these diagrams for the last 20 years. When we wrote this book, though, we decided to really expand the examples and the different scenarios. And we came up with, I don't know, 50, 60, 70 examples. Of course, my sister wasn't available to draw them, but the Groundwater Project had these wonderful illustrators and graphics designers, and they stepped in. And so I am not taking credit for those. They did an amazing job, for the design. But we worked back and forth. They would send me an example, a diagram, and then I asked for modification because it wasn't quite legally correct or exactly the way that I wanted the explanation to present, and we came up with numerous examples. I will say, I think there's maybe 40 or 50 diagrams. It's not comprehensive. With groundwater, there's always more scenarios that you can come up with that it's not in the book, I'm sure. But there's so many good examples in there. They did a really wonderful job with the diagrams.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And you can use your examples to expand to different situations, different scenarios that are not covered in the book. But most of them, the most important are there, I think, right? And some of the ideas I wasn't, aware of the way of putting you presented new diagrams, for example, for the same situation but with a different rate of extraction, so you have different results. That's quite interesting. So we can use the example for other situations that are not covered. Very good. Very good. So one question that hangs over our heads as we listen here and there, that future wars will be fought over water. How likely is this? Because if we don't have laws, and people are taking my water. So is this already true anywhere in the world? What can you say about that?
Look, water. I mean, it becomes a cliche to say water. You need it for life, right? It's important. It's critical for everything, all the type of life that we know. So it could be a source of dispute, because if you need water and I need water, how much water is available between us? Well, are we going to fight over it? I have to say that, and there's been many studies about this. Water has more often been a source of cooperation than a source of dispute. And if we look back at all the history of water challenges, there are more examples of cooperation going back. I think people have studied this for 3,000 or 4,000 years. There's a few scenarios where you can say, maybe water caused a conflict here, but there are hundreds times more examples where people said, we're in a dispute over water, but that we cooperate over because we know we need it. We know we have to share. We know we have to find a common ground over this limited water resource. And we realize that we have to come up with different technological and methodological ways to manage it. So we can expand the use, whether through desalination or recycling or alternative water sources. People are, I think, creative enough and willing to cooperate more on water than I think most people imagine.
Yeah, that's good. Isn't it an optimistic point of view, or is it realistic? What do you think?
Well, based on the data, I think it's realistic. I like to be optimistic, but if you look at all the examples of cooperations, hundreds and hundreds of examples where a conflict started but then was resolved.
That's true.
This is so I think it's realistic.
Yeah, I agree too. Well, and if you think on statistics, you need water, every day of every time, in history, and the wars are placed here and there, in a short period. Depends. Even long wars are short compared to the whole history of humanity. I agree with you.
But how many have been over water? I mean, there's very few very few that you can say the cause was water. You can say lots of places where the conflict started because of water, but then you see the resolution. You see that they've resolved the conflict without going to war. And so there's lots of examples like that. So I am optimistic about it.
Yeah, well, I do too. I work for that too. So that's good. So how do you believe a hydrogeologist that has very little understanding of law could profit from reading your book after all?
Well, I think the way to read this book is just to at least have a basic understanding of, from a legal point of view, of cause and effect. As a hydrogeologist, you should understand the cause and effect. You pumping over here, cone of depression, radius of influence, it's going to have an impact over there. From a legal point of view, you put a boundary here, a fence or an international boundary. You start to understand, I'm now affecting their resource. Oh, wait, it's a shared resource. but it's their resource. So now I have to think about, well, is it, can you have responsibility? Can you have liability? Do I have to prevent the liability? What actions do I have to take to reduce the impact across the border? Borders are artificial, but it's hard to get rid of them, right? It's the politics that we live in. It's the society we've created. We've created boundaries everywhere, and we have to deal with those kinds of boundaries. And part of that is liability, in terms of, if I'm not careful, that effect will go across the boundary. This is the kind of things I want hydrogeologists to understand, because I know hydrogeologists like to look at the aquifer as one unit, and they want to ignore the political boundaries because water doesn't care. Well, I agree. I wish it was that the world was so easy. We shouldn't care about boundaries and all live together, right? But the reality is we have boundaries everywhere, and we do have to think in terms of jurisdictions and political units and legal responsibility. So
that's very good. That's very good. I'll try to translate your book into Portuguese. Here in Brazil, we have many water basin, we call water basin committees, but they're all related into the surface water division. And groundwater does not respect, as you put, and it's well known, does not respect exactly the same boundaries that we use for surface water. So what applies to surface water may not apply, and people working for those groups, and they are very well organized. They need to learn more, at least the basics, so they can. And then I think your book will do a great job for that, because it's very readable, even for non-hydrogeologists and non-lawyers, which is most engineers, hydrological engineers as well. They don't know hydrogeology, which is very good. So well, I'm very glad to have you here with us, and congratulations for your book. It was a pleasant read, as I put to you before, and I hope people will read that. We'll make sure we'll make a good divulgation of the book throughout the world, and I hope we can improve this knowledge, and we have guidelines and evolve faster into good laws to everybody. Thank you very much. Please make your closing remarks.
Well, I just thank you for the opportunity to participate. I think this book is going to be a little bit different than a lot of the other books in this series, because they are much more focused on the science. This is much more policy and law oriented. So but I hope it contributes to the knowledge. As you said, we need to keep educating the public, the lawyers, the hydrogeologists, the engineers, and so on. So I look forward to participating and engaging with everybody on this.
Thank you very much. So everybody, we had here Gabriel Eckstein. It's a great book. Please take a look at the book, download. Remember, it's free. And like and share our posts on social media. Help us spread this news. And when you see the post about this book, go to our YouTube site and share it with your friends. Take a look. It is very important that everybody, not only hydrogeologists, know about the importance of groundwater laws and boundaries, and not only international borders, as Gabriel mentioned, but your neighbor. You might be having problems with your neighbor and you don't even know it. So learn about it is going to be ever more important, and the book is a great step forward into that direction. Thank you, Gabriel. Congratulations again for a nice job.
Thanks so much.